we're going to spend 4 weeks looking at Paul. And I'm not going to argue for or against him, but I'm going to present him as I think he is and let you make your own deductions and decisions about how you feel about him. Paul is undeniably an important figure in our faith, and so we are good to spend some time with him if we can. I made 40 copies of everything, which may run us a little short, which is exciting, but if you are able to share, feel free to do that. We good with this up front here? There are 2 handouts. One is a map, one is a sort of timeline, chronology, geography there, okay? You won't need those immediately, and I'll let you know when it makes most sense to look at them, so they can continue to make their way around, but I'll get started with my comments here. In order to talk about Paul, we need to just get a few baseline things established around just the general time and timeline of the New Testament and the events that the New Testament describes, because those aren't congruous. One of the things to remember is that the New Testament, the New Covenant, is compiled and put together into what we would consider something more like a book over the course of a couple hundred years, right? It didn't happen overnight. So there's a time that it takes to collect and then codify these documents. And it's very much then the codifying of these documents, the editing of them, the stitching of them together is very much happening in conversation with the early theological discussions and debates of that day and age. Okay? That'll make more sense as we move through this, but just have that in mind. Like the Old Testament, the New Testament has a number of different genres of writing in it. Okay, so they're not all the same. And if you know how to read, which many of you do, or if you're an experienced reader, you know that the genre matters, right? You don't read letters like you read the newspaper. You don't read novels like you read nonfiction. There are ways in which the genre matters, and for us, that's going to matter. We're going to be specific to letters in this, but that is going to be as compared to biographies like the Gospels or theological arguments, which are somewhat different necessarily than letters are. We'll talk about that later, but I just want to set that out. But unlike the Old Testament, so multiple genres like the Old Testament, but unlike the Old Testament, the books that we have in the New Testament are compiled over more like 100 years, not like thousands of years, like the Old Testament. So there's a compressed window of time, and there's a lot happening historically at that time. A lot is happening in Rome, a lot is happening to the people of Israel, and that will be reflected in these letters as well. Okay? So short window of time, about 100 years. And they're written, all these documents, somewhat under duress. Being a follower of the way, a follower of Jesus, not a Christian, that word didn't exist yet, right? But being a follower of the way was dangerous. It was subversive. And it could be dangerous. Over those first couple hundred years, there were periodic persecutions for which you could easily be killed, arrested, had your reputation destroyed for being a Christian, for being a follower of Jesus. All right? But at this time, you were still technically a Jew, which was an occupied and oppressed people already within the context of the Roman government. So you see sort of how this is all coming together a little bit. This is the way background here. Now, swearing fealty to a lord who was not the emperor is really the issue here. It was not a theological problem that the Romans had with the Christians. The theological debates were between the Christians and the Jews. It was more a political problem based upon the fact that, there was one God and his name was Caesar something. Okay? Now, if you also know, the Romans, when they were trying to create these periodic persecutions, did so a lot of times to use someone as a scapegoat for the crumbling that was starting to come around the edges of the empire. And so that's when you get Christians who are thrown into the arena to be killed by wild beasts or to be strung up and flayed, all sorts of terrible torture and death that comes along with that. Those were the early Christian martyrs suffered those fates. So the New Testament then is coming together in that context. So it's not easy. I just want to make that clear. It's not easy to be a Christian. It's not easy to write about being a Christian. It's not easy to keep documents that identify you as Christian, right? Okay. The New Testament then is pulled together generally as a way to try and tell people about Jesus, very simply, and to try to make sense of his life, his death, and his resurrection. What does that mean within the context of Judaism, from which it sprang, and in the broader world? I mean, essentially they're saying, like, everybody's just trying to figure out what the heck just happened here. Because something happened, and we still don't know quite what to make of it. Everything has shifted. And it takes them some time, decades, to sort it out. It started as an oral tradition, as most things did back in that time. Things were not immediately written down. And you wonder then, okay, why did they start writing it down? Well, they started writing the Gospels. We don't know exactly, but we think because there was an expectation that Jesus would return very soon. He'd be coming back quickly. And as time went, and the earliest Christians and the first generation of people who knew Jesus start dying out, they figure we better capture these stories for posterity. Maybe this is happening on a slightly different timeline than we expect. Paul, you will find, has a very clear understanding that Christ's return is coming imminently. And so we could just wait it out and we'll be good. Did it work that way? Did it not? That's an interesting theological question. All right, the letters and the epistles, though, are written for a different purpose. Those are practical documents used to organize and inspire and to chastise and establish these earliest Christian communities. And we're going to look very specifically at that, and that will be a lot of what we spend time doing together. But the letters have a different purpose than the Gospels. The letters also, and this is where you got to sort of bend your minds with me a little bit here, the letters predate the Gospels chronologically. So you've got Jesus, and then you have people who wrote about Jesus, but they're writing about something that happened before this period of time that Paul is writing in. So I'll try to call your attention to that as we move through this, but just have this in mind that our earliest window into the Christian world comes from Paul, not from the Gospels, even though the Gospels are writing about something that happened before that. You see what I'm saying? This is why we got to sort of free your minds, people, all right? So, Paul, good guy or bad guy? I'm not going to tell you. You decide. But there is an open debate. And perhaps he was both. Probably was both, like most of us. All right? He is trying to make sense of Jesus. And it's tricky because the theological context that he helped create gave birth to the communities who wrote the Gospels about Jesus. Do you see how this turns back in on itself now? So Paul's impression of Jesus is very much a formative influence over the communities and the groups that are then going to write the story of Jesus. So Paul is integrally related to what it is that is happening theologically and in those documents that we call the Gospels and come to know Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, there are people who argue that Paul twisted and mangled the ministry of Jesus. There are others who say that there would be no Jesus without Paul, because he was the one who established people who would tell that story and spread that message in the broader world than just Judea. That is an open question, but Paul becomes this central figure, not just in his time, but in the analysis of his time, over and over. And you can find tons of books on him trying to discern who he is, what he was about, and what he was really after. All right? We're not going to go into all those, but just know that's out there. As I said, all his letters predate the Gospels, the earliest of which is the first letter to the Thessalonians. If you know that one, you probably weren't raised Episcopalian, but that's okay. No, so first letter to the Thessalonians dating about 50 to 52 AD. Okay? Now, like I said, this means that many of the most, and that's 20 years after Jesus' life, death, resurrection, right? So we're looking at a 20-year window until that letter arrives. And we'll fill in those blanks a little bit in the next few minutes. As I said, many of the most important early theological themes and the development of Christian communities, what will become the church, come from Paul. He gives us the earliest look at how people were making sense of Jesus. For example, the Lord's Supper, communion, the Eucharist. We know about that from Paul, not from the Gospels. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For I received from the Lord, Paul writes, what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Sound familiar? In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now think about that for a second, right? So that means that Paul, by the time he's writing for 1 Corinthians, it's another 10 years from Thessalonians, right? He's writing about what he had received, which means there was already a practice established of this ritual meal in the earliest Christian communities, not because they had read it in a book, but because they had received it from Jesus and his closest followers. You see how that window is different than looking at the gospel version of it? Paul is saying, this was already happening, so I said, okay, and I handed it on to the next guy. The Lord's Supper dates back. That is part of the reason it becomes such a central feature. Not just because of its place in the narrative, but because of the narrative of Jesus' life, but because of the way in which it was an established practice from about as early as you can see back into the earliest Christian communities. Okay? Now, Paul's key themes, just a quick overview here. He's often repeating similar themes even though he's writing to different people, while also dealing with particular issues in each of these communities. He had two major concerns, if you want to boil it down. He's basically trying to tell people, what are we supposed to believe? And then, how are we supposed to behave? So think of this. There's the orthodoxy, right belief, and orthopraxis, right practice. Paul is dealing with both of those. He's trying to make theological sense of Jesus in relationship to his understanding of the Jewish faith. And then he's trying to say, given that, how should we live? Those things are not separate. Sometimes Paul gets read strictly theologically, and that misses out the practical concerns. Sometimes there is an over-focus on the practical concerns that this guy said, well, I think we should do this, at the expense of some of the theological themes and understandings that he promoted. Orthodoxy, orthopraxis, what are we supposed to believe? How are we supposed to behave? Now, some of the theological themes that he comes back to over and over again, the role of the crucifixion. Jesus died so our sins would be forgiven if we believed in him. Resurrection, opening up everlasting life to all who believed in him. The second coming, salvation for those who believe in him. You can see faith is a central component of his life, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. And then he spends a lot of time working through the relationship between Jews and Christians and Gentiles, arguing, figuring that out. Now, we'll talk about this when we get to letters specifically, but Paul is working through these things for a reason, because they're very personal to him. The idea that faith is central to your participation in the Christian life is extra important because Paul never met Jesus. He only has faith to go on. Right? So that becomes very personally important. And you can see letters are very personal documents. And they betray or transmit very much the person who is writing them. There's a lot of that person on the page in a letter, right? So, there also is saying, okay, this relationship between Jews and Christians is important because he was a sort of very vigorous Jew in his day, and now is trying to understand what this Jesus relationship would mean to that, as well as understanding his call to go to the Gentiles and spread the message to them. So how do they fit in? His context is then very central to the themes that he works through. That's always true, no matter who you are and when you're writing. You cannot escape, as much as you may try, your own personal context when you create something especially like a letter. All right? Now, ideas he has about how people should behave. Central to that is the role of community. One of the reasons we're choosing to focus on Paul for these few weeks is, as I said a couple weeks ago, our theme this year is this to know and be known. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. 1 Corinthians 13, you hear it at weddings all the time, right? that idea of community being based in knowing and being known, the formation, the establishment, the maintenance, the building up of community is a major component of Paul's work. So how we behave with one another then becomes central to his writing. Now, this practical area is where things can get a little thorny, because he tries to be more prescriptive, less theologically sort of wondering or establishing ideas, and more like you shouldn't do that and you shouldn't do that. And that's where he gets into issues around his views around women, slavery, homosexuality. Not a central part of his writing, but definitely a part of it and part of his legacy, for better or for worse. And particularly also how Jews and Christians should relate. Paul also often gets read very anti-Semitically, which I think is a mistake because of not just who he was, but what he was actually trying to say. But that's part of his legacy, how he has been interpreted over time. Okay? That's background, overview, preparatory work. You following? You with me so far? All right, good. Let's move on to his biography. Okay? So review, Jesus was born, he lived, he died, he rose, and the apostles start spreading his message. That all happens around 33 AD, right? Paul enters the picture soon after all of this. As I said, he was not one of the disciples who followed Jesus around while he was on earth. He never met the guy. In fact, by his own admission, he was a zealous persecutor of the earliest followers of Jesus on behalf of the Jewish authorities. But he has this conversion experience and does a full 180 and uses then his zealousness to start spreading the gospel rather than persecuting it. That conversion we can trace more or less to about 35 AD. So within a couple years after Jesus' death and resurrection, but not immediate. Okay? Now, let's read that call as he describes it. You may be familiar with the account in Acts, but let's read it from the first chapter of the letter to the Galatians. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, that's Peter, and stayed with him for 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie, Paul says. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard it said, the one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. Now, this is a long passage, but it's really important and really central, because this is Paul's version of his conversion, which is different from the version in Acts. There's nothing about a horse. There's nothing about being blinded. But somehow he has such a profound experience of Jesus that he can start proclaiming him even before, you heard him say, he went and talked to anybody about it. He didn't go back to the sources and say, to the apostles and even talk with them. It was years later that he talked to them about that. And he wasn't really, he was discovering this, determining this all on his own. Now, this leads to me into a conversation about the two ways we know about Paul. One of them is from his letters. And there are letters that we scholars are convinced are written by him. There are letters that they have questions as to whether they were really written by Paul himself or some of his followers. And there are others they know were not written by him. We'll get to that probably in the last lecture, the Deutero-Pauline line. But we have those letters. We also have the book of Acts. But Acts is written as a compendium to the Gospel of Luke, which means it's written much later and for a much different purpose. Remember the idea that the purpose of the document matters to its composition. It is a theological history. It is not a documentary history. And that's different. So sometimes Acts and Paul's letters conflict. They don't tell the story, or they don't line up, they don't make sense. And because we are trusting the closeness of the source, in those circumstances, the letters are given sort of scholarly priority as to accuracy. Acts is not always reliable, then, as a historical document, which doesn't mean it doesn't have important theological lessons to teach us. That's an important distinction. But it does offer some details that, again, don't line up or don't make sense. So, baseline, what can we glean about Paul is that he was from a strict Israelite family from the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes, circumcised, member of the Pharisees. But he also grew up in a Greek or Hellenistic world. Greek was his everyday language. You can see that in the way he writes. He knew the popular philosophical trends and rhetoric of his age, so he was then a Hebrew from the diaspora, which means had been sort of spread out from Jerusalem and the surrounding area into the Greek world, and he had a good Greek education while also maintaining a real strength within his Jewish identity, being a Pharisee, one of the most strict sects there. Acts has him originally called Saul, which is not unlikely. Jews in the diaspora, in the Greek world, often chose Greek or Roman versions of their names. So Saul is a Hebrew name. Paul or Paulus would be a Roman name. Okay? Now, what would his persecutions have looked like? Acts makes it very dramatic, but the reality is that historically his persecution probably looked more like this, that members of the local synagogue, right, from the Jewish communities that he was with, who had confessed Jesus and spread his message in the community, would be, by his efforts, excluded from it or could be maligned in a local court or brought before the Roman authorities. What Paul probably did not have the authority to do is to transport people from outside of Palestine back to Jerusalem for punishment. It didn't work that way as far as how much power he would have had within a larger Roman system. So he's going through whatever that looked like. It was maybe a little less intense than you would think of him, like this marauding crusader riding through the ancient world. Probably not as much like that. But he experienced his call somewhere near Damascus. But he never calls it a conversion, which is interesting. He only calls it a call, a revelation. And it's tied up in his experience of the risen Christ, as we just heard, and this directive to go and to be an apostle to the Gentiles, which is a really big deal. If you're going to understand Paul, you have to understand this how the question of the Gentile inclusion in the faith. Judaism was the one who had this idea of the Messiah. So to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, the chosen one of God, the Savior, is inherently to make a Jewish argument. He is the one that fulfills all the Jewish prophecies. The question then becomes, could that covenant, could that law be opened up to other people or to non-Jews? Or was Jesus only a Jewish Messiah? Remember, the Jews are a people of law and lineage. It's the laws that they follow and the line that they can draw in their family line. They are born into it, and then they abide by it, by the rules and practices. That is how that identity is not just formed, it is how it's maintained throughout the millennia. And to change that then would be fundamentally disruptive, because it would change one of the cornerstones of what it meant to be Jewish, or to be a chosen people. So that is why the relationship between Christianity and the Jewish law becomes really central to what Paul is trying to do. You follow me there? Because this is a really key, important part that will continue to play out as we move forward. So Paul shifts, we'll see, from his he has an agreement with Peter and James that he would go and be an apostle to the Gentiles. He's like, they're saying, okay, that's okay, while they would focus on the Jews. Yes, Keith?
Is Is that defined as non-Jewish?
Yes, in this context, non-Jewish. The Roman, Greek, some other faith tradition, that would be the general understanding of it. In this context, mostly Greek people who are living in the Roman system. Yeah. So after, though, so they have what they think is a sort of rapprochement. They decide that they're going to be, you go to the Gentiles, we'll stay focused on the Jews in the Jerusalem and Judea area. But then Peter comes and visits Antioch, where Paul is based. And he starts promoting the idea. And so when Peter comes, he is eating with the Gentiles in a normal way, without the ritual washing or keeping kosher. But then some other visitors from Jerusalem come, and Peter says, "Oh, I can't do that anymore. I have to eat with them." And Paul's calls BS. And he says, "Wait a minute, it was fine a minute ago, but now these other people are here, and you're worried that they're going to judge you or misunderstand what you're doing." And so Paul then shifts his argument from saying, okay, we can have Jews and Gentiles somewhat separate. He starts making the argument, as we'll see in these letters, that actually now the law, while important, is no longer applicable. It has been, the need for it has been removed by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is different than saying Jews be Jews, Gentiles be sort of Jews. It's saying everybody needs to be able to have this opportunity to live free of the law. Okay? We'll see that again in some of his letters coming forward here. But that freedom from the law is the move that he makes theologically that means that any and all can be included through faith in Jesus Christ into that relationship with God that before had been the purview of just the Jews. All right? But it also, as I said before, has led to Paul being used for anti-Semitic purposes, which again I think is an incorrect reading of him. His missions. We'll go a few more minutes, then we're going to open up for questions, okay? I know I'm going. This is a lot to parse through. After his call, he says he spent 3 years in Arabia. That's Damascus and its surrounding area. And you can look at your map now if you want. This will be helpful to you. This is a little bit of why I have a little bit of a problem when people say they've had a Damascus Road experience. Because the way Paul describes it, and even in the Damascus Road experience, it takes him years to kind of process that experience before he starts proclaiming it publicly. So that idea of the immediate conversion, I would argue, is not terribly scriptural. He had been given this vision, this illumination of what he should be doing, but then he had to go and work out exactly what that meant. And that took some time. But after 3 years, he went to Jerusalem. So look all the way to the right side of your map if you have it. If you don't, we'll have more copies next week. You'll see the sort of area of the sort of what we would call the Middle East right now, right? The Holy Land. And so he goes from Damascus to Jerusalem for 2 weeks. But then he says he only met with Peter and James, and it seems to confirm what he's doing. He can be an apostle to the Gentiles. But then he says that he was working for a longer period of time, which ultimately ended up totaling 14 years. The majority of Paul's ministry happens in that time, but we don't see it because we don't have any letters from that time. And in that time, he's working up and down that coast. You see Syria, Damascus, Cilicia, up along there. That is the area that he's moving in before he moves into Turkey and Greece and eventually into Europe more fully. So this is a long but unknown period from Paul's ministry. We don't have any letters from this period, but he was in that area in the east there, and he established the center of ministry at Antioch. Antioch was probably the center of his work, and he is focusing on converting the Gentiles, as I said. So if you think that Paul's thing all just happened like that, you really have to realize he had a long time, many years of practice and work that went into eventually what we see in the letters, which happen soon after that. Does that make sense? You following me here? This is an empty period that is fascinating and important, but we don't know much about because we just don't have any documentation of it other than these few references. It's after that point, and now you can pull out your timeline so you can follow along here with that. So you have your timeline in your map as we go through this. 48 AD, so 35 or so AD, he is called. 14 years, he says, he spent working through all this stuff. And then in 48 AD, he said, you know what, we need to sort out some differences we need to really settle this Jewish and Gentile thing. So he calls for a council. And in a sense, he has created what is a competing center of ministry for the early church in Antioch that is competing with Jerusalem. And they're competing theologically because they have this different approach to the inclusion of the Gentiles, as I said. Peter and James are in Jerusalem. They're focusing on the Jews. They're speaking Aramaic. They're literally not speaking the same language. And then you've got Paul in Antioch, who's, yes, Gentiles, come, join us, not as bound by the Jewish law, and they're speaking Greek. So there are already, within 15 years of Jesus' death and resurrection, there are divisions emerging in the church. Right? There are different centers of power, different understandings of the message, and who gets included there. So if you think that church conflict was new, 'twas ever thus, okay? So even a gloss here. Don't call it the church, but it is the establishment of the church. It's not a church yet. That word does not apply. It's not used here. The validity of the law, the inclusion of Gentiles, this was the issue that in Antioch that Paul calls the meeting for clarification. And really, it's personal because there's a man named Titus. And Titus is an uncircumcised, that does matter, I'm not just throwing it in there, Gentile convert who accompanied Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem. So they go from Antioch to Jerusalem, and the question is, are they going to accept Titus? Are the brothers in Jerusalem going to accept Titus, who is very clearly not Jewish? How are they going to deal with him? Or, and this is the question, are they going to force him to be circumcised, which would be a deal breaker in Titus's case? I'm serious. This is the issue. Because that is what it means to abide by the Jewish law and show that you are going to, become Jewish in order to follow Jesus. So they make an agreement, happily for Titus. Peter and James and John recognize the validity of Paul's mission, that he can go to the Gentiles free from the law. In return, all they ask is that he remembers the poor, that is through his prayers and his collection of money, and then send that money back to Jerusalem to fund the ministry of the brothers who are working in Jerusalem, in the early church. And that becomes a big part of Paul's ministry. So remember the poor and provide for them, which is another point that I always stress when I teach about Paul. If you think we invented stewardship campaigns, you are also sorely mistaken. The funding through the generosity of members of the community has always been a central part of the church from the beginning. And I don't just say that to be glib. It's actually really important because it shows the way in which that community is supporting each other and the broader community of which they are a part. Okay? Now, that also means that church unity between Antioch and Jerusalem is based on prayer and charity, not necessarily on doctrine or praxis, which is interesting. The people in Jerusalem don't adopt Paul's message whole cloth. They say, you can do that, and we will continue to do this. And we will still be united in our work together. Another important point, I think, for us to carry forward. Now, there is an argument that happens after this that I just said in 48 or 49. Well, sorry, so then they go ahead, and then we have the issue between Peter and Paul. Paul's message starts to change, and that change of message brings him into an argument in 48 and 49 with Barnabas, his good friend and buddy. This Jew-Gentile thing is not entirely resolved, as you can see, because they've sort of said we're going to agree to go slightly separate ways and move forward as parallel tracks. But that means there's space for disagreement. So after that whole moment between Peter coming to Antioch and eating and then stepping back and Paul calling him on the hypocrisy of it, Barnabas says, I don't think you should have done that. I disagree with you. And so they agree to split ways. Paul then moves on, and that's what sends him into Turkey and Macedonia, north of Greece. So it is at that break, at 48, 49, in that window, that he moves from, say, the Middle East into what we would call Europe. And that becomes a big shift. He starts establishing the communities that we know about. So I'm going to stop there because that's a lot to digest and see what questions we have. One second. And then next week what we're going to do is pick up with this movement from this shift from the eastern world, essentially, the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, into Turkey, into Greece. And that's where you're going to start recognizing some of these names and some of these communities, and we'll talk about how his letters then fit into the establishment of these communities and then the running of, the management of these communities over time. Okay? So we've got ourselves up that big chunk of early Paul today, plus some background context. Questions? I got Bill, Carrie, Jamie, Bill, and Andrew, is that a question or just thinking? Okay, good. Bill, go ahead.
Paul, you say, was born with grew up with a Greek education. I presume he didn't grow up in Greece. Where did he grow up?
He grew up probably in that Damascus area, which is part of what they call still beyond the immediate surrounds of Jerusalem and Judea.
And second question, you say he was working for the Jewish authorities in persecuting the early Christians.
Yes.
So I presume that's how he got to know what the early Christians believed.
I think that's probably right, yeah.
But to what extent was, if any, because I've always heard he was a tax collector, was he also working for the Roman authorities? Or was there...
I've not heard tax collector. I've heard that he was a Pharisee, maybe a tent maker or a tanner of some sort, so a man who worked with his hands. I've not heard him, I've seen him referred to as a tax collector. That's fine. No, but that's a great question to try to clarify that. But I'm saying there's a lot of unknowns around Paul, so we try to fill in the blanks, and some people fill in the blanks from a theological perspective, others from a political perspective, others from a historical perspective. So there's lots of stories circulating about him, and I'm not going to give you a definitive story. I'm going to give you the best I can, which comes mostly out of a book from my professor, Helmut Kester at Harvard Divinity School, and this is essentially a survey of history and literature of early Christianity that he wrote. And that's mostly what I'm working with, but there's a lot of other stuff out there if you want to go looking for it. Thank you, Bill. I had Carrie?
In Corinthians, when he talked about community, did he have a sense of real presence or constancy?
That would be an anachronistic idea. So, I mean, we can't say, this is what we have. Literally, this is the scripture that we have for it. So we can't say exactly, does that mean real presence, transubstantiation, consubstantiation? That is all later, 1,000 years down the line when the church is finding more things to argue about. Yeah. Bill, yeah.
Did these literally start out as one single piece of paper sent to one location and then their energy started to copy them? Or how did this happen?
So we'll talk about this more next week, and this is fascinating, right? It doesn't start with the letters. The letters are follow-up. It starts with people, and it starts with relationships. And it starts with him going into communities and living there, dwelling there, meeting people, going within the synagogue, so communities that already exist, but then also reaching out into that community. So we had like a home base, and then he would it's like house churches. This is not like buildings. This is people meeting together and sharing meals together and choosing to live in a certain way together. And that's what, I think we might have a grander vision of what these things look like than what they really were. They were that tenuous and that small, and yet, I'll say this next week, we have a church. And it's somewhat miraculous given how it started. But yeah, so we'll get more into that next week. But then the paper, the actual documents, the letters, are written on parchment and rolled up and hand-delivered by one of his associates back to the communities that he had visited with for a year or 18 months. And then they would hold those and they would read them. They weren't scripture, right? They were letters. Their scriptures were the Old Testament. And these letters were related to that and about what they should believe and how they should manage their life together. Yeah, good. Andrew, yes, Andrew, go ahead.
Wouldn't most early Christians have been illiterate?
Yes. That's why they would have someone go and they would read the letter to people out loud. It would be sort of part of their gathering. To call it a worship service would be too grand a thing, right? Part of their gathering would be reading this missive, this epistle from this person that they trusted that had given them their formation. But yes, a good question. Stephen.
So this idea of the law is no longer important. I'm wondering, because you have these Christians, mostly among the first Christians, mostly among the Jews, but spread to the Greeks. Among the Jews, the law is an important part of their culture and context. Does that become a challenge to them, and did it perhaps become part of the reason why the Western Church grew quicker, and now here we are, our church is this end of the Church of Rome?
I would say, actually, if you look back at it, the church that went east also did okay. So there were people, so when Paul's turning west here, there are other people that are turning east. And there was, even down into sort of the early Christian communities in East Africa and further into the Middle East that are very old and as well. The question you ask about that is, yes, this approach to the law created major problems between Jews and Christians, but you see those, they fester for a little while, and you see those exploding in the Gospels. And a lot of people would say the Gospel of John, which is the last of the Gospels to be written, exhibits an authorial context that is highly conflictual with the Jews and the Christians. So John, as beautiful and wonderful and incredible as that gospel is also seen as the most anti-Semitic gospel. And we run into that on Good Friday, particularly as we read, the Jews are the ones who killed Jesus. And that gets picked up and taken to its worst possible end over history. So, but yes, that happens 50 years on from where we are right now. And in that context, things have split, for lack of a better term. So there is conflict there. Yeah, Jennifer.
I'm wondering, like in divinity school, how they address, and I don't know the author, but how you were taught, like the years that he's in Arabia, with and I'm going to say the name wrong, but the cult of Mithras, how the idea that while he was in Arabia, like the fundamental things we get from Paul and the Eucharist and things like that got transmitted from that religion and then absorbed into Christianity.
That's an interesting point. So I think the background of what you're saying, which I didn't talk about, is there's questions that have been raised about other sources of information Paul would have taken to integrate into the Jewish message, thus creating the Christian message. I'm not as familiar with that identity. I think those are speculative. There's probably some evidence towards it, but I don't think there's any definitive understanding of saying, well, he pulled this or he pulled that, or I think there's a lot of he might have learned this here, he could have gleaned this there, but somehow he came up with it and found it. I think what it does tell us, though, is that the Christian message, as a message that is particular within Judaism, had spread beyond Judea and Jerusalem without Paul. How exactly that happens, we don't have a clear picture, but some of the apostles who do go and start spreading this message must have had some success at getting the message out there, because he rarely comes to a place where there's no knowledge of Jesus. He often comes to a place where there's some, even just a few, people who are doing things like sharing a meal together. And that's an interesting question. Yeah. AJ?
Yeah. As far as, how did he make his inroads in with the Gentiles? Are we going to talk about that next week?
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that next week. We don't know exactly, but I think it was pretty old-fashioned. It was getting to know people. It was preaching. It was teaching. It was inviting them into it. He does it. Exactly how he does it, we don't know, but it seems like those were his general practices.
So you said he was a tanner or a tent maker or something. He had business, and so that he had customers. Yeah. And he chats with his customers, and his customers said, well, come on to dinner, and they sit down and
he lays it on him. It could have been as mundane as that. I'm not kidding. It could have been as mundane as that. We don't know. It also could have been as grand as him trying to sort of stand up in a synagogue and say, any of you people here, this is what we're trying to do here, and then that he gets himself in trouble doing that in some of his other places where he's preaching. So it could have been very private. It could have been somewhat public. We don't know exactly, but the truth is somehow it happened, and that's a real wonderful mystery. Yeah, we're going to have Bill and Stephen one last question, then we got to go get ready for church.
Would he have gone to Jerusalem?
Yes.
As a Pharisee?
Probably, yes. But he only refers to, in general, to his earlier life in Judaism as a Pharisee. he doesn't give us as much specificity as he does later on. Yeah, Stephen.
Kind of a silly question, but the issue with Caius being uncircumcised, how do people know? I mean, no one here knows what uncircumcised is.
That is another one of those mysteries that has been lost to time. So we will, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. All right, so we'll end on that note for today. And we will join again next week. If you can join us again, we're going to pick up as he moves his way out of the Middle East into Europe and starts founding communities. So next week, a lot more names and places that you are going to be familiar with. So thank you very much. We'll see you then.